So welcome back to the Immeasurable podcast. I'm Henry Fischer. I'm one of the producers of the podcast. I'm here with Jaap Sluijter. He is the director of the Krishnamurti Foundation of America. We're here today in Pine Cottage. We hope Pine Cottage will be open to the public shortly. And we're in the place really where Krishnamurti lived. He lived as well in Brockwood Park and also in India and traveled the world for many years. And I thought I'd mention that Krishnamurti's mission, I think, is more relevant today, you could say, than ever, to set humankind unconditionally free and to really end conflict and suffering. And today's guest, Rupert Spira, who we're having back on the podcast, shares this mission with us. And Rupert Spira he's a public speaker. He's an author of books on non-duality, on the direct path, and insight. And before Jaap gets into the subject today with Rupert and myself around the relationship between thought and awareness, I thought I would ask Rupert, and follow up from last podcast. He spent some time with Krishnamurti at the end of his life going to talks in Brockwood Park. And as a young man, Rupert, I was just going to ask you what you as a young man may have gleaned from those talks, what they may have inspired, if anything.
Yes. Okay. Well, first of all, hello, both of you again. Thank you for inviting me back. It's lovely to be with you again. Yes, I grew up just down the road from Brockwood Park in Hampshire. And from about the age of 20 through to 26, when Krishnamurti died, I every summer attended his talks at Brockwood Park. So I was a young man. I had been aware of the non-dual teaching for some time, for 3 or 4 years. I had already learned to meditate, and I was studying the non-dual tradition. But Krishnamurti was really the first living teacher that I had met, and I was hugely impressed by him. I think there were two things really. They were both his fierceness and his tenderness. And by fierce, I mean his passion for clarity and truth, and his uncompromising, unwavering loyalty to truth, and the rigor with which he pursued it, and the rigor with which he questioned people. So I loved that. But he was also very gentle, very tender, very sensitive, very poetic, and it was this. It was his way of being, as much as anything that he particularly said, that really impressed me. And one of all the meetings I went to and the talks that I sat through, the actual incident that impressed me most was in between two talks. There was a long queue. There was a tent outside in the gardens of Brockwood where we would queue up for lunch, and I was in a queue, and I turned round to find Krishnamurti standing. I was way back in the queue. There must have been 100 people or so in front. I turned round to find Krishnamurti standing just in the queue next to me. There was no preference. He hadn't walked straight up to the front of the queue to be given his lunch and to take it off and have it. He was just waiting along with everybody else. And when I turned round to him and noticed him, I was a shy 20-year-old man. He probably felt my nervousness. So immediately he just made a comment about the gardens, about the weather. He was so unpretentious, so ordinary. And that, again, it had such an impression on me, that the manner of his being, the way he conducted himself. And I remember that now as clearly as I remember anything that he particularly said. And that was a great inspiration to me.
Yeah, that sounds beautiful, Rupert. Yeah. And I've seen the pictures. You know, when I got interested in Krishnamurti, it was probably in '84, and I went to the talks in Saanen. I never went to Brockwood at the time, but I remember. I mean, also there you had the tent, and so I have a sense of what you're talking about. Yeah.
Yes.
And I've
Yes.
seen many pictures in the archives. We have many pictures of Krishnamurti in that queue. So, so probably I can, if I now look back at the pictures, I can probably pick you out there. So you will probably be in one of those pictures. Yeah. Is this a good moment for me?
I think so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, Rupert, I have. There are two things. I would like to say something about the topic of today, which is the relationship between thought and awareness, but also like the wider context of what we're trying to do. And Henry has spoken about it. The Krishnamurti's mission, as you can say it between quotes, was to set mankind unconditionally free. He said it in 1929. But somehow, you know, I mean, for me, for the largest part of my lifetime, that really has been my interest, right? Of course, you can challenge to what level I was interested, but this has driven me somehow, and has driven me to be working for the Krishnamurti Foundation. But also before I worked, I was really much involved in somehow supporting this, because I felt if there's anything I want to do in the world, that seems to be for me the most important thing, right? But if I have to unpack that, you know, and maybe at a certain point, maybe you're willing to give that a try also. Is that like, you know, mankind seemed to be caught in illusion, and there seemed to be a potentiality there, right? A human potentiality, which the potentiality of freedom, there may be a potentiality of living differently. And we, as humanity, and it's actually nice to take that as a humanity trail instead of me or a particular group, we have tried different things, right? We tried religions, we tried fasting, we tried controlling. And we haven't solved that really. And I mean, by all when I took the distance picture, it seems to be that the spiritual approach, meaning understanding oneself and maybe going beyond, seems to be where the treasure is, if I can put it that way, where maybe a different dimension or a different perspective is possible. And now, so when I say what is the context of this meeting today, I would hope that we can somehow, can we contribute to that human movement from darkness to light, maybe put it that way, right? To whatever is required at this point of time in history to somehow make a contribution to lift the veil, or something like that, or put a little candle, you know, or maybe a bigger candle, whatever we can, you know, to somehow bring, to contribute to the change of direction, maybe, or to contribute to the new humanity. Let me put it that way, or however we're gonna label that. So that's my invitation there. And so then I kick off with the topic. So from that context, the topic then, so that means that the topic for me is not an intellectual topic, right? It's really a topic that's close to my heart. It's really the topic of awareness and thought is something that, like in my life all the time. You know what I mean? I mean, being quiet, and I know you're also meditating. Being quiet and looking. And being available to the present, something seems to be happening there that's maybe underappreciated at the moment in our culture, but it seems to have potentiality there. So now I'll just like to put out, and it won't be too long, but just a few minutes on what Krishnamurti said about awareness, because he actually never mentioned awareness as this is awareness. He said, well, there's superficial awareness. Just you open your eyes and the visual come in, your ears, you hear things. That's superficial awareness. And then he would say, well, but there's also what it evokes, the emotion that it evokes. And he said and you can be aware of that. So then there's like a second layer or something. You become aware that you're agitated, or that you like something, or you feel attracted to something, your emotionality. And then he said, okay, but then it's also possible for the human being then to be aware that that is happening, that the emotionality, the thoughts are coming into your being, coming into your presence. And then he says something funny, and that's why I'm starting this introduction, and I would really like to engage with you on that. Because he said, then at that moment there is something, a potentiality. Now, if you from that emotionality or from that thinking try to find your way out, it's the wrong question. He would say it's the wrong question because that will come again from desire, from wanting to get out, moving away, escape, right, or an ideal. But he says, if you see how the self comes into being and you become aware of that, then there's a discontinuity. He said there's something that, and so I would love it if you could somehow explore that from where you are, with your point of view, and because this is for me the crux, the pivotal question for me in everything that we're doing. So
yes,
thank you.
I would agree that the essential question is, as you've just expressed it, to see how the self, and in this case I'm presuming you mean the separate self or the ego, to see how the separate self or ego comes into being or comes into apparent being. I agree that is the central issue, rather than simply pursuing whatever it is the separate self is pursuing, be it freedom, enlightenment, happiness, rather than just continuing that pursuit. One pauses that pursuit and investigates the self who is pursuing it, the one who is seeking happiness. When we say, I want to be happy, I want to be free of suffering, I want to be enlightened. Instead of pursuing enlightenment, instead of pursuing happiness, who is the self? Who is the I in the statement, I want to be happy? And it's very interesting if we begin to search for that one, to make not a philosophical or a theoretical investigation, but we actually explore in our own experience, what is our own experience of this self who is unhappy, that is seeking happiness. And we begin to look, as you said earlier, the first thing we encounter in our experience is perceptions of the world. And then we begin to look inside. Usually the first thing we find are thoughts. But thoughts obviously don't constitute our self, the one who is seeking happiness. So we discard our thoughts. As you say, we next find a layer of feelings. But likewise, feelings don't constitute our self. They are what we have. So they can't be essentially what we are. So we discard them, and we go on, going back, going deeper into ourselves, looking for the self on whose behalf our unhappiness, or on whose behalf our search for happiness or enlightenment arises. And if we trace our way back in this way, we never find that self. If we go all the way back, we find just the openness, the emptiness of awareness. But that doesn't constitute a self, a limited self. And in fact, if we then begin to explore the nature of awareness that we essentially are, we find it is inherently peaceful. There is no sense of lack in it. So it turns out in the end that the self on whose behalf our search for happiness arose is an illusory self. And I think that this is in very different language. I think that this is what when Krishnamurti encouraged people not to seek for enlightenment or happiness, but to question, to try to find the self. I think he was doing the same investigation in his own way, encouraging people to do the same investigation. In other words, to find the illusory nature of the one who is seeking happiness or enlightenment.
Rupert, just one moment, just one technical thing which we'll take out. If your camera is out of focus because I think your hands were, yeah, there you go.
Yeah, okay,
You're
just
back.
just
Okay,
remind me
okay.
just remind me if
Perfect.
it goes out.
If that happens again, I will say it.
Sure.
Before we go more into awareness, I wonder if it's clear what we mean by thought and how deep thought may run. Of course, there's the apparent thoughts, the thoughts that pop up in the head. But I wonder if you could talk at all about some of the structures of thought that organize perception. Maybe there's a sense of me that is continuous, and I could be sitting and not necessarily have apparent thoughts, but still be organizing experience in a localized way around the idea of an individual, maybe some kind of feeling of comfort, making sense of things. And likewise, I'd also say another way we might also talk about thought would be that could be going on. I could also be in a somewhat, say, peaceful state, and all of a sudden something happens that disturbs me, and a reaction arises, and very quickly it seems like maybe there's a threat out there, and I'm separate from that threat, and having to manage my experience in a certain way. So my question is, how deep does thought run? And are there different forms of thought, how to address all of those? Because in some ways I could see, it's been my experience that even awareness in some way it seem like there's something that's being aware, and maybe thought could be involved in a misunderstanding of a more global awareness. So could you talk about the different levels of thought a bit and tease those out?
Yes, I would suggest that there are three possibilities really for the type or quality of thinking. So a thought could arise on behalf of the body. Let's say a thought, I'm hungry, let's cook dinner. When thought formulates that idea, the I that it is referring to is obviously the body. It is the body that is experiencing hunger. The word I is just a loose generic term for the body in this case. So in this case, the thought is rising on behalf of the body. If you are in pain, I must go to the doctor, or again, a thought like this arises on behalf of the body. And then there are thoughts that arise on behalf of the belief that we are separate, finite entities. The self that we tried to find earlier, the self when we say, I am unhappy, I am seeking happiness. Well, when we say, I am seeking happiness, or I want enlightenment, the I in this case is obviously not the body. The body is not unhappy. It's not seeking enlightenment. And awareness is obviously not unhappy or seeking enlightenment. So the thought that arises, I want happiness or I want enlightenment, on whose behalf does this thought arise? It arises on behalf of a self which, when investigated, cannot be found as such. So this is a second category of thoughts that arise on behalf of an illusory entity. And then I would suggest there's a third category of thoughts that arise, whose purpose is to express the qualities, if we can call them qualities, that are inherent in awareness, our true nature, or whose purpose is to explore our true nature. For instance, the kind of thoughts that we are having now. The thoughts that we are having now are not arising on behalf of the body, but nor do they rise on behalf of an illusory self. They arise on the behalf of the desire for truth. So I would suggest that was a third category of thought, and all of our thoughts fall into one of these three categories, I would suggest.
Yeah, it's actually it's very interesting there because of course so somewhere so that's actually that last bit I really like, because it somehow clarifies something. Like in Krishnamurti's work, what he would often say something like, yes, there's this third level awareness where you become aware that you are caught in the self, that the self is all encompassing in all your thinking. And then he says, but also you realize then that if you put the question to move out of it, if that question comes from that space to move out of it, actually it's part of that, so that will keep you in place. And there he puts an interesting analogy there, and I would wonder what you think about it. The analogy is somehow, okay, there's two banks. The river has two banks. I don't know if you heard that analogy. So if you're on this bank, meets the conditioned, you're on the self, you're caught in thought. From that bank, you cannot possibly ask the question to come out of there. The question has to come from the other bank. But as soon as you from this bank try to put the question, you're stuck on the bank. You somehow, and then he has this. It's almost like like a Conan or something. The question has to come from the other bank, which is a very cryptic way of talking about, right? He somehow says, in order to put the question out about enlightenment, you have to be enlightened, or in order to be free, you have to put the question from freedom. So it's a strange Conan, as if that it had a discontinuity. So what do you?
And of course, that which is inherently free has no questions about how to become free. The question is always question about how to obtain freedom is always from the point of view of the one that seems not to be free.
Yeah.
And I think rather than that one cannot find freedom, because its very apparent presence is the veiling of the freedom it seeks.
Yeah.
So all it can do is investigate itself.
Yeah.
That's one thing that it can do, and that doesn't take it, that is not an escape from itself into enlightenment, happiness. It's not any escape from itself is, as you mentioned earlier, it's a subtle and naturally not so subtle way of perpetuating itself.
Yes.
But the one thing that it can do is turn its attention to itself. Who is this self that wants freedom?
Yeah.
Rather than seeking freedom,
Yeah.
who is the one who wants freedom?
Yeah.
And I think that's it's another way of saying what Krishnamurti was saying, that with the analogy of the two banks, he was undermining the separate self's search for freedom.
Yes.
By saying you can only really ask that question from the other bank, and as you say, it's a bit of a koan, because from the other bank there's no question of freedom at all. But so what he was really doing, I think, was to undermine the separate self's search for freedom, and I would agree that is the ultimate way. I would just use another process or another analogy by saying that instead of seeking that freedom, the separate self should investigate itself, the one on whose behalf its desire for freedom rises, which is a way of undermining its search for freedom.
But you use the word undermining, which normally has a quite negative connotation. But you mean it in a very positive way, right? You say undermining in the sense of as a leap or something. The undermining as...
Well, yes, undermining it. Another way would be to emphasize the positive aspect of what I mean by this. Undermining the apparent reality of the self who seeks freedom. If the self who is seeking freedom or liberation or enlightenment or whatever is understood to be illusory, then how can its subsequent search for freedom stand? So it's a good thing that this undermining or seeing through of the illusory nature of the separate self undermines its search and actually brings it to that place in itself which is prior to its feeling of being bound or suffering. So it's a positive. I don't mean undermining in any negative sense.
No. If I can, is it okay? I want to put a few more notes in there because undermining as an action, like one could get the impression, which I know you don't mean, but I just want to bring that out because I feel that's really where the depth is. I feel it's not that an entity is undermining. You know, there's no entity that's actively saying I'm going to undermine. It's somehow so. If we want to say, how does this undermining take place? How does this discontinuity takes place? And in Krishnamurti's work, he would say, well, you know, somehow there's a moment where thought realizes that it's limited. That seeing is the leap, nothing more. There's not an active. He says thought realizes it's limited, and by realizing it's limited, it's on the other bank somehow in that way.
Does he mean thought there, though? Does he mean thought realizes rather than something that is not of thought?
No, he says thought realizes it's limited, and when thought realizes it's limited, it subsides.
Well, I wonder what he means by that. I mean, I wonder if he means, because it would seem that something else would have to be aware of that.
Yeah, I think he's using language casually when he says a thought realizes this. A thought obviously cannot realize anything or understand anything any more than a glass or an object. But within the limits of language, it's a legitimate use of language. But he doesn't literally mean that a thought realizes something. He means that which understands realizes that thought is limited. And that understanding frees you right that moment. If you see clearly the limitations of thought, then that which sees that is by definition free of those limitations. I think that's what he means.
And just to go off also what you said before, Rupert, about this seeing the illusory nature of thought, and that when we investigate, we see that maybe there's nothing really there as a separate identity that's putting this forth. Maybe it's a mechanical process in some way. My question is, it seems a lot of times when we reach new levels of understanding, what previously we believed, we see through. We see some idea we had, it shatters, and we have a new understanding. But I think, Krishnamurti is pointing to something that may be a bit more like a psychological death, like an element where there isn't a new illusion that's formed. But I guess my issue with all this is that traditionally, we always think this. We think the new understanding we have liberates us from the old illusion, and now we see things more clearly. But later we find, wait, this again was another layer. This again was another layer. So I'm asking two questions. One is an element of an actual psychological death necessary for the other shore to come into being? I mean, Krishnamurti said there's no way to the other shore. He says, if the mind has stopped groping and searching, if there is total emptiness and space in the mind itself, then and only then is it there. He also says the unknowable is only possible when one dies to the known. Is this a gradual process, or is this understood in a way that's different from moving from one illusion to the next?
Okay, can I give you an analogy that I quite often use? I don't remember whether I used it on our last conversation, but it's an analogy that's very well suited to this discussion.
As long as it's not King Lear.
It is.
Yeah. No,
you don't like King Lear?
No. I'm just the reason I was joking a little bit, but I do want to mention we did go into the analogy.
That's good. In that case, I don't have to elaborate. An actor, John Smith, plays the part of King Lear. So to transpose this onto Krishnamurti's analogy of the two banks. The two banks, one bank is the first bank you mentioned, was King Lear, and the second bank, the other shore, is John Smith. So using this, King John Smith obviously represents what I would call our true nature of pure awareness. John Smith is the character, the separate self, the clothing of our true nature in thoughts and perceptions. So with that analogy, your question, Henry, is some kind of a death necessary? Yes and no. If we provisionally accept that there is a person called King Lear, that there's one person called John Smith, and there's another person called King Lear, who is somehow superimposed on top of John Smith, in order for the recognition, I am John Smith, to take place, does King Lear have to die? Well, the answer is, if King Lear exists as a person in the first place, yes. King Lear has to die to his knowledge of himself as King Lear before the recognition, I am John Smith, can take place. But that is said as a concession to one who believes that King Lear is existent in the first place. At a deeper level of understanding, King Lear never existed at all. There was just John Smith veiling himself with his, or seeming to veil himself with his own activity of thinking and perceiving, and seeming as a result to become King Lear, and then unveiling himself or coming back to himself and recognizing himself again as John Smith. So from this point of view, there's no question of King Lear having to die, because he never truly lived to begin with. He was an illusion. However, I think what Krishnamurti means, and what is traditionally meant by dying before you die, is this: it's not the death of an entity, it's the death of a belief that we are an entity apart from John Smith. In other words, that we are a separate self as opposed to ever-present unlimited awareness. That belief dissolves, and as we recognize I am John Smith, the belief I am King Lear dissolves. That is the death, or the apparent death, of the separate self.
If King Lear keeps rearing his head, if that hasn't died completely, if there isn't an end to conflict, an end to images, to image making and creating, could it cause the John Smith to identify with awareness? The only reason I'm saying that is I'm not totally clear, and we're moving deeper into this, that a certain, what we might talk about as awareness, or conventionally talk about awareness, isn't also produced by the brain, isn't just another layer. And I'm wondering if there's something that makes one sort of arrive at no recognition whatsoever. And I'm also asking, how particularly do you mean that word recognition? Because Krishnamurti almost always mentions recognition as memory. So recognition as a past. So how is this recognition not of memory? And wouldn't freedom be like the falling away of both the King Lear and John Smith?
Yes, okay. So let's imagine that the play of King Lear is taking place. King Lear, John Smith is on stage in the form of King Lear, and he's completely lost in the part he's playing. And as a result of that, he's suffering. He's squabbling with his daughters and the French. He's suffering. So his friend, we're slightly rewriting the play now. Imagine that in the play he meets a friend, he tells his friend about his suffering, and his friend says to him, you're not suffering because of your relationship with your daughters or the war with France. You're suffering because you've forgotten who you truly are. Who are you really? And then King Lear begins to explore who he essentially is, as we discussed earlier. And at some moment there is this recognition, I am John Smith. That recognition is not a memory of being John Smith. It is the present experience of being John Smith. The reason I call it a recognition is because recognition means to know again. It doesn't mean to remember something from the past. It means to know again. Now, John Smith's knowledge of himself as John Smith, as opposed to King Lear, is not a marvelous new experience that he has. He's always known himself as John Smith. He just temporarily lost himself in the part of King Lear. So it is a recognition, it is a re-knowing of himself again. But that doesn't imply knowledge from the past. When, in the middle of the play, King Lear pauses and says, I am John Smith. And at that moment, his suffering ceases. There is no memory involved in that recognition. It is his present, direct experience.
Is there sense making involved? I mean, when we say
No,
memory, it doesn't require sense making. Does it require any time or sense making?
No. The recognition, I am John Smith, does not take place in the time and space in which the drama of King Lear is enacted. Mm-hmm. So the recognition of our true nature, of pure awareness, does not take place in the time and space that is familiar to us in the waking state. And it is not a knowledge that can be known through the finite mind. In other words, it's not a knowledge that we gain through thought or perception. It is a knowledge that awareness has of itself prior to thought and perception and independent of it. In other words, John Smith doesn't know himself through the character of King Lear.
And what
He knows himself directly.
and what's the evidence of that not being another one of these core understandings, which later might evaporate? I mean, it seems like it seems, and I think it might be my misunderstanding, that you're talking about something, that there's,
But I'm
it's
talking
prior
about
to
it.
form, but it seems to have something to it, no?
If you don't want me to talk about it as something, we would have to remain silent.
I see. Well, that's helpful.
So it's just a convention. But we want to talk about
I see.
these matters, and I think we all understand that the reality that we are trying to speak about cannot be described in terms of its parts. Now, if we want to stay really truthful to that, we must just remain silent.
That's helpful.
Every word we speak is untrue.
Actually, you just saying that now gives me a bit more clarity, because I can see you're having the conversation because, in a sense, this is the best we can do. You're trying to give, it's the best we can do, but you're leaving the door opened, in a sense, for saying the actual understanding of this is beyond words, memory,
Absolutely.
convention,
Absolutely.
Conversation, potentially.
Not a single word that we say is true. If we want to speak the absolute truth, we should remain silent. Picasso said this beautiful thing about art. He said, all art lies, but it points to the truth. All spiritual teachings, however finely they are expressed, if you're minded to do so, you can find fault with them. Thou art that, one of the great Mahavakyas. If you want to, you could analyze that and say, no, it's not quite accurate. No, it's not quite accurate.
Could I change direction a little bit? Sorry,
yes.
I hope I didn't.
Thank you.
Yeah. No.
Because we started with set humanity unconditionally free, right? as an over and I said so if we in this hour, in this half an hour, how can we what is our contribution to that, right? In the sense of, if you feel responsible for that in one way or another, and hopefully some younger people will also listen to this podcast. People maybe in various situations, but what do you feel? And of course, I know you're a public speaker and you write books, but what would you feel is needed at this point of time in society? I mean, Krishnamurti at his time, when he set up centers, he set up schools, and publications, and we're online with all the stuff. But what do you feel is what is the contribution that needs to be made to society, or does society require now in order to contribute to a new direction? Let me put it that way. What is, from your point of view, what needs to be done? Or what do you want a young person to hear? I mean, which is somehow also an overlapping question. Yeah. And maybe I can, before you start, maybe I can say a little bit of the context. Like we're here in the Krishnamurti Center, and we have about 4 to 5 students living on campus who dedicate a year of their lives to studying this. And we're planning in the near future to expand it almost to 18. We really want to have some kind of university-like, scholarly-like, ashram-like situation here, and because we feel at the moment that this is like really a critical thing, right? Everybody, it's going all for career, status, survival, but that otherness needs to be cultivated somehow. So I just want to, so that's what I want to explore with you. I want to open that up with you,
Henry, you started this conversation, I think, by saying that Krishnamurti's mission was to end conflict and suffering for humankind.
Yes,
That,
his direct quote was to set mankind unconditionally free.
okay, all right. Well, let's say that what everybody wants. If we were to take these young people, that you're referring to, if you were to ask a young person, what is it that I really want in life? Of course, there's many ways one could answer that question, but I think there are two essential things that everyone would answer in one way or another. One relates to our inner experience, and one relates to our outer experience, that is our experience with other people and the world. So in relation to our inner experience, what people want above all is to be happy. And in relation to our outer experience, we want to be free of conflict. In other words, we want to have loving relationships, not hostile relationships. So these are I would suggest, the two things that people want: to be happy on the inside and to have loving, harmonious relationships on the outside. So if we can accept that, at least provisionally, that's one way at least of expressing what people fundamentally want, then what the next question, which is your question, what is required? And I would suggest just one thing is required, and that is understanding. Understanding what? Understanding the nature of our self or our being. If we understand the nature of our self or our being, we recognize two things. One, that the very nature of our being is peace and happiness. If one recognizes that, that removes the entire search for happiness in objects, substances, activities, relationships, etc. You find fulfillment within yourself. That answers the first question. And the second aspect of the understanding is to recognize that our being is shared. That at the deepest level, we share our being with everyone and everything. Well, I would suggest that is the experience of love. I would suggest that love is the recognition of our shared being. In other words, to answer your question directly now, what I think is required is understanding the nature of our being, recognizing our true nature. It takes care of both the desire for happiness on the inside, and it takes care of the ending of conflicts on the outside.
So, I like that, and I just want to probe a little bit more, if you like, just to clarify and to bring. If you say, well, our being is happiness, right? Our being is, but I can imagine a young person, if you would say that to a young person, well, I mean, if I look at my being, I see anxiety, I see fear, I see conflict, I'm conflicted, I see desire. So how do you move from that, which is what somebody would share, to where you're saying, hey, well, what you experience is real, but your real nature is love. You know.
I would suggest that if somebody says, well, when I look at my being, I don't find peace, I find anxiety and fear, I would suggest that they are not looking at their being, they are looking at their feelings. Yes, if you look at your feelings, you find anxiety, fear, sorrow. I totally agree with that. But if anxiety, fear, and sorrow were inherent in our being, they would always be with us. So they cannot be inherent. They are feelings that we experience from time to time. so they are not essential to us. So our being is that which is essential to us, that which cannot be removed from us. And I would suggest, well, you might now argue, well, okay, but I don't always experience happiness. Therefore, happiness cannot be essential to my being. To which I would say, no, you haven't looked closely enough. Your being is by definition always present. You are always present. And its nature is always happiness. When happiness seems not to be present, it is simply because it is veiled by feelings. Just like the obvious example to use is like saying, well, on a grey, cloudy day, it's like saying the blue sky is not present. The blue sky in this case represents our true nature. The blue sky is present, but it is veiled by clouds. The clouds come and go. The blue sky doesn't come and go. That doesn't mean to say the blue sky is always shining.
Yeah.
It's always present, but it's not always available. I would suggest that our true nature of happiness, our being, whose nature is happiness, is always present, but not always available, or it is always available to us, but it is not always experienced because it is veiled by the cloud cover of thoughts and feelings.
Can I just ask one question? Because you're on the happiness, but I just have a little doubt there. Krishnamurti, his books don't often include that word that often, happiness, and freedom is always emphasized.
Okay.
And what I wonder is, this being, does this being have some, desire to be? Of course, in our apparent experience, being is at the root of any other experience we have, any feelings, there's being there. But I wonder, about freedom being in some way freedom from even resting there, whether there's a potential for a mind to be not even requiring happiness, whether Krishnamurti mentioned, I don't mind what happens, it may be pointing toward some sense of, I mentioned this last podcast, discontinuity or wildness, a dimension of freedom that transcends happiness. And I only say that because happiness is also peddled quite a bit. People dangle out, this will make you happy, or this will make you happy, and maybe paying attention to my being will now make me happy. It's enticing. But is that the be-all and end-all, or is freedom the same as what you're talking about, or is it another? It's the same.
Just the same. It's just another. If it is legitimate to talk about the qualities of our true nature, of course, it doesn't really have qualities, but freedom, peace, joy, happiness, love, these would all be synonymous. And I think that I would suggest that when Krishnamurti said, I don't mind what happens, what he was really saying is, my happiness, if I can be permitted to use that word, or perhaps he would say my freedom, my innate freedom, is independent of and prior to the content of experience. The sense of freedom I have, I would say the sense of peace I have, the sense of freedom I have is not dependent on what takes place, whether the stock market crashes, whether I catch the virus, it's my peace, my freedom is prior to that. Why? Because it is the nature of my being.
Yeah.
Everything else.
Yeah. Sorry. No. I think one of the it's the word happiness that again has just different meanings. Right. One definition of happy. Krishnamurti in his discussion with Bernard Levin, which is quite a prominent interviewer in the BBC, right, or for Channel 4 in England, where you're from, and he said, but aren't we supposed? Bernard Levin asked Krishnamurti, "Are we supposed to be happy?" He said, "Happy?" He said, "But happiness. What's happiness? A fleeting pleasure. A fleeting pleasure." So that's clearly in a different definition of happiness. And I think I can take your. I think I can be. I can go along with your definition of happiness, but
I completely agree that if
Yeah.
we equate happiness with pleasure,
Yeah.
then I totally agree with
yeah,
Krishnamurti.
yeah.
I would suggest that pleasure, I distinguish between pleasure and happiness for the same reason that I distinguish between pain and suffering.
Yeah.
Pain is a sensation.
Yes.
You can be in pain and not suffer.
Yeah.
So there is a distinction between pain and suffering. You can also not be having a pleasurable experience and be happy. That's why I make a distinction between pleasure and happiness.
Good. Thank you, Rupert. I think it was really enjoyable to engage with you. Very generous of your time, and we haven't spoken, and maybe in the future we can, because you're also an artist, right? I mean, that doesn't come out anyway. And
I am indeed.
And Henry forgets that in his
No,
introduction.
it's because he does it. He's not in the studio anymore.
Well,
so
it's true.
I leave that out because I listen to his work.
This is my studio now. I'm in the studio now.
But I think I think there are folks out there that I think want to get him back to making pots.
That would be another beautiful conversation, because Krishnamurti was very sensitive to beauty.
He was.
Yeah.
So that would be another very nice conversation.
Yeah.
But thank you both. There was much more meeting, not only of mind but of hearts in this conversation. So I'm very happy about that. I think we got over our. I see actually now that we speak more. I'm beginning to see more clearly how our use of language differs. Even it wasn't as obvious this time, but even in this conversation, I noticed the differences in our use of language, and that just requires sensitivity on both our parts, not to make that a stumbling block, and to accommodate each other's use of language and to work around it. And I think we did much better this time.
Definitely.
I could understand much better where you were coming from and what your use of language. Well, when you object to the word happiness, I understand exactly why. So I'm glad. It takes a while for these two worlds to gel. But I'm grateful to you both that we had a second conversation. I felt that our first conversation was unresolved, and it didn't sit comfortably with me in view of my great love for Krishnamurti and respect for him. And so I wanted to make sure there was some meeting and some resolution. So thank you both for having this conversation.
Thank you, Rupert. Really fantastic. Yeah, I thoroughly enjoyed, and also was happy that we could look at the bigger picture, and contribute to a different world, because I feel that's where we really want to try. Yeah.
Good. Well, thank you both.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Rupert.
Aye.
Take good care. Good luck with your opening. I hope it all goes well.
Yes, COVID is over now, almost. I'm getting my vaccination today, so.
And mine
Very
tomorrow.
good.
So.
Very good. I've already had mine.
Oh, great.
Okay.
All right,
good
Rupert.
care.
Take care. You too. Bye.
Bye.